now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength of street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.
Damn, that shit was dope.
What do you think of that, Dave? What do you think of that video? So welcome everyone. This is Warrior Creed. I'm the Radical, Maajid Nawaz, and above me there, I think it's above in the video format there. That's the infamous Usman Raja. And our guest today is David Fleming. And David was a co-founder of Together. A lot of you would have heard the Together movement. Alan Miller is another lad, a man, I should say. Sorry, Alan, who with David founded the Together movement. They did fantastic work opposing COVID mandates. And now, and the reason we've got David on Warrior Creed with us is because David has now started something called Not Our Future. Is that right, David? Is that what it's called, Not Our Future?
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're really keen to speak to you. One of the things I think that we found interesting, and we're going to hear about what Not Our Future is that you're looking at a grassroots-based organization model. It strikes me, and I'm going to stop speaking in a second, but it strikes me as a dissemination and distribution network to oppose the Great Reset. That's how I understand it. I've summarized that just so the audience very early on understands what we're talking about. But we'd love for you to explain to us and our audience what is Not Our Future. But before you do, also begin telling us a bit about your involvement in Together, how you came to this work, why and how you ended up opposing the Great Reset, Build Back Better, and then, of course, what Not Our Future is. And while you're speaking, please don't be offended. If I'm looking down, I'm tweeting the link out to encourage people to join this live stream. So, David Fleming, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Maajid and Usman. We've only got an hour. I've got enough to say. It's my first proper chat, in public on all of this, so I've got a lot to catch up on. But I'm by profession, I'm an environmental health officer. That's the only. I didn't work hard, in school, so that's all I got. And
are you what for government?
Well, local government. Yeah.
Nice. So you're the guy we call if there's like a dead seagull in the road or something.
It covers housing, public health and safety, food safety, pollution, all that. I usually work in food safety, but I mean, I can come back around to it. But basically, the job was sort of shelved for 2 years during the pandemic. But then we were hijacked, and it was us who were enforcing the COVID restriction stuff.
Wow! So your job entailed enforcing COVID rules on people.
Well. I usually work as a contractor, so I was left with no job when COVID started, and then I did basically if like say a gym won't shut down like during proper lockdown, and someone turns up to shut them down with the police, that would be an environmental health officer. It would be in the people I work with. In fact, I worked one famous case.
The enemy. Sorry.
So if we want to blame anyone, it's you. Let's go after him.
No, I mean, I have to be careful what I say, but basically, I didn't do anything. I didn't contribute in any way to anything. I would swerve any job, that kind of thing. But it did open my eyes. Well, obviously, I didn't leave my eyes opened really, but it sort of confirmed everything I'd heard about groupthink and everything. But just quickly, I mean, I never wanted to do this job. I ended up in it. I was always trying to escape to motor racing, so my experience in sort of marketing and presenting like an idea or a company or a brand comes from, I escaped a few times to Formula One racing. I worked in marketing and that. I worked for the Williams Formula One team in the 90s, doing all their graphics and stuff. And so that was interesting. So I learned a lot that way, but I'd always end up going back to environmental health, to pay the bills and stuff. Because I was always trying to be self-employed and do my own thing, which sort of never really panned out. But so to cut a long story short, I was always, since, for about, around the time of ClimateGate, but it was a coincidence. It wasn't because of ClimateGate, but ever since around then, I was sort of like a climate denier, and it was getting worse. So in 2018, this explains where I am. I mean, obviously, I went down the rabbit hole on loads of things like anti-war and like the Iraq War and everything and all that
Well, I
terrorism.
mean, that's a
Seven,
good thing, mate. That's to
yeah,
be out
seven
of Iraq,
seven.
yeah. Well
Yeah,
done.
I mean, I was it was my son's first birthday on 7/7 in London, and I didn't go into London. I would have been around Liverpool Street at that time.
Wow.
I wouldn't have been on a train or anything.
Yeah.
But so it was when Extinction Rebellion announced themselves, and Roger Hallam said, "Oh, we're going to get people to go to prison." You know, that was sort of made me perk up my ears a bit. It was like it looked like they'd started going on a different level, because it always seemed like the climate thing was being kicked down the road 5-10 years. No government seemed to want to handle it. And then shortly after Extinction popped up, then Greta Thunberg and all her stuff came along, and then so it looked like they're getting a bit of traction. Then in November 2018, the midterms in America, AOC was elected for the first time, and she obviously had been primed to put forward this Green New Deal. And that was the first thing. She was talking about building a bridge to Europe and no more flights. I mean, things that ridiculous. So it was so ridiculous that it moved the Overton window a bit, so that by the time they came back to saying, oh no, it won't be that bad, it'll be retrofitting all houses with insulation, no more, gas cars, that sort of stuff. That all sounded reasonable after what AOC was talking about. So I was getting worried. And then shortly after that, Theresa May signed us up to net zero because she was on holiday in Italy, and she saw that the glacier she'd seen 20 years earlier on her other holiday was a bit smaller than it was before. That's how scientific it was. Well, obviously she was told to sign up to net zero, but that was the excuse she gave.
Yeah.
And then at the elections 2019, it was all about Brexit, and both parties had net zero in the manifesto, so that just went through anyway. So I was really worried. So here we are in January 2020. I didn't know what to do, and I was coming up with plans. Basically, my plan was this, not our future. Different name, but the idea was to get out there with information to tell the public that this net zero thing is a disaster. But then COVID comes along, and I just figured that COVID was, they'd finally, with all this stuff, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg, Theresa May kicking the ball off with the UK signing up to net zero, Green New Deal in America, it looked like they were happy. They thought things were finally going to happen. So they brought in COVID as a sort of a hammer to knock us all down and, smash us on the head with a hammer. And then when they stopped beating us, we'd wake up and we'd be happy to be in net zero. And that's sort of what's happened, really.
So that's also what you're describing there, and the AOC example you gave. It's interesting because this idea that a prominent voice presents a very extreme option, everybody gets scared that because they don't want the extreme option. Government comes in and gives us the very bad option still, but because it's cut all flights and build a bridge from America to Europe, the bad option, whatever it is, feels palatable and reasonable compared to the outlandish thing that was proposed. And it's a very old tactic that people do.
Yeah. It's as old as the hills, they say. So, and that's where we were basically. And they're doing that all the time, aren't they? I mean, who knows? Like this time last year was all about vaccine mandates, going to sack everybody, and then they decided not to sack everybody, and we're all happy supposedly. But where were we? We had this precedent that's been set in the last 2.5 years that the government can do anything they want basically, and we're technically we think we've won, but obviously it's
so bring us together. How did that idea come about with Alan?
Well, I mean, so when lockdown started, I set up a thing called Lockdown Truth just around the same time Toby Young set up Lockdown Skeptics, and I did that for a couple of months, but it was a bit of a jokey thing, it was a bit irreverent, so I decided to set up something more professional, which was COVID-19 Assembly. And if you look at the website for COVID-19 Assembly, you'll see the graphics I got made were all about disseminating information locally. I got all these graphics made of people in town squares looking at
David,
graphs.
was that you? COVID-19 Assembly, you founded that?
Yeah.
See, I didn't know that. Well done, because I've obviously
All
come
right.
across COVID-19 Assembly. I mean, you've obviously been a serial grassroots network founder.
Yeah. So I mean,
That's good, Usman.
the idea
I heard that.
the idea for COVID-19 Assembly was we were going to do more on information and content and get the information out to people, but it became quite a difficult task to get the content done, and so we decided to do projects instead. So the first project was the COVID deaths audit with Claire Craig, and to back that up, we set up this whistleblowing service with Francis Hoare and Philip Highland. And
This is
Peter
all a
Edgehill.
heart group, yeah, of doctors.
No, it's just us.
Well, Claire Craig, is she not with Heart?
Oh, well, she's with Heart, but she did the COVID deaths audit with us. That
I
was
see.
separate thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
it wasn't a collaboration with Heart. It was just Claire.
Well, I mean, some other people in Heart were involved, but it wasn't a Heart thing. But you know, it was our thing. But it still is. I mean, it's ongoing. I mean, basically, the deaths audit, it's a huge project, and it's crucial. And we are going to finish it. We're going to do our best. But that's why Not Our Future ties into it, because we'll be reaching every home in the country. So we'll be getting our information out to every person who.
Before you get to Not Our Future, I'm going to try and understand everything you're doing, because you've done a lot.
Yeah.
You've done even more than I realized and Usman realized.
Yeah.
So let's
So
start with this. Which one came first, COVID-19 Assembly or together?
Oh, COVID-19 Assembly. So
All right, tell us about that
Assembly.
first. Tell us what it is and if it's still live, including this death count you're talking about, so that people know where to go to find it and look at it. And then tell us about Together and then Not Our Future.
Yeah, well, I launched COVID deaths audit it was the 1st of September 2020, and Martin Kulldorff, you know, from the Great Barrington Declaration, he was one of my advisors. So was Francis Hoare and Toby Young, and that was before Martin Kulldorff became famous. He became famous a month later when he signed the Great Barrington Declaration. But as I said, the idea was to get information.
So, these are all just for your info. I don't know if you caught these names. But
Yeah, Toby, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, so Toby we've spoken to on Warrior Creed. Francis Hall's been on the Radical Show, and Kulldorff is a famous. These are names that have all been very vocal against the lockdown, against mandates, and it sounds to us now, which is what we're learning from you, David, that David's been behind a lot of the organisation to help these voices and organise the information that they've been using. So carry on, David.
So yeah, in March 2021, we launched the deaths audit, which was a big project. So it's not finished, and some people like on Twitter are saying, "Oh, where you're grifters, just where's the results, So, but it's ongoing. It's a big thing, but it's going to get bigger.
What does it seek to do? Does it seek to look at the number of excess deaths?
No. The basic idea was that, we were scared into complying with all the restrictions because people were dying, and obviously they were dying. They were said they were dying of COVID, but most were dying with COVID. They were dying of other stuff, or some didn't have COVID at all. See Dominic Frisby the other day talking about how when his father died, and they wanted to put COVID on his death certificate because it would be quicker from an admin point of view, even though he wasn't even tested positive. There was no COVID mentioned anywhere. The hospital thought it would be better to put COVID on it just for admin purposes. So we just wanted to basically show, it's still a hypothesis, but let's face it, it's, we probably know it's true, that the amount of people who died from COVID in any way was tiny compared to what we were told. And we just want to use that then to show to the public that it's all lies. Don't believe anything the government tell you. Don't believe anything the media tell you. It's all just been made up. Not saying nobody died from COVID, but it's the amount of people who died from COVID. It's going to be minuscule. There was a sort of, I don't know how official it was, but
sorry to interrupt you, David. Do you include in that, because I've done shows on this, I'm fascinated, and I didn't know that you were behind this project, but do you include in that a way to know who died of ventilators, who died of midazolam and morphine? Because a lot of this died with COVID, which is the majority, as I'm sure you understand. The vast majority of people didn't die of COVID, they died with COVID. And those that died with COVID, usually when you look at cause of death, if it wasn't as the coroner rules, because of AstraZeneca jab or because of the Moderna jab, if they were in care homes or hospitals, it's usually they were on end of life protocols after being put on ventilators, then they were given midazolam and morphine.
Yeah, well, I'm no expert, but yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, I've got all sorts of theories, but one of them is ventilators. If the government had decided to up their the amount of ventilators they had, like in 6 months before COVID struck, they would have looked a bit suspicious. So, do you remember in March, April, there was this big flurry of activity with like even Formula One teams and car manufacturers, re-engineering their production lines to make ventilators.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's
Dyson,
like,
was it Dyson was volunteering himself, wasn't he?
yeah, I mean, everybody was doing it. McLaren Formula One team and everybody. So it was like they got their hands on ventilators without it looking suspicious. If they'd the way Matt Hancock ordered an extra whatever doses of midazolam,
Yeah.
but if they'd also ordered a load of extra ventilators, it might look dodgy as well. But it's speculation. But that's just the way I think. But yeah, so anyway, because we were launching the death audit, we knew that we were going to rely on whistleblowers. So we wanted to set up a whistleblowing service, and a proper one, not just send us information. We promise not to tell anybody. This was the information would be collected and sent to a solicitor, and we wouldn't even know anything about it. The solicitor would deal with it, and then anything that was promising, the solicitor would enter in a proper, relationship with the client, and it would be done for free, pro bono. And if there was a proper court case later, we'd crowdfund it to the best of our ability, or get possibly donors to come in. And so the first case of that was Sam White. Dr. Sam White was our first sort of high-profile case that came along.
So we've had Sam on the Radical Show,
Yeah.
and Dr. Sam White, Usman, for your info, he is one of the first prominent doctors that got struck off for opposing all the mandates. Yeah, as a doctor, he gave a professional opinion. The medical board struck him off. He went to court and he won the case, and they reinstated him because they'd also said you're not allowed to tweet or post anything social media criticizing the mandates. He won the case and he got reinstated. And again, David, you seem to be at the center of that. So you guys were the whistleblowing organization he used initially, are you?
Yeah. So he came to us.
We got here, man. It's the crisis culture behind everything.
We put him in touch with Philip Highland. Philip Highland did everything. I mean, ironically, I've never even met Sam White. Yeah. It just never happened, So even though
I was just going to say, David, about when we're talking about informing the people and coming with something that creates proper positive activism. If we go back to the beginning of COVID, remember my brother here was the first one. Remember those conversations we were having back when you were at LBC, Maajid, and we were talking about what was actually going on in the hospitals. Now, I don't want to talk about what my sources are, but enough to say there's a lot of people that me and Maajid are involved with that were behind closed doors within different establishments, and there was a high death rate going on from a bronchial disease, COVID, at that time. Now, what we've got with this is post-COVID as well, because what we have to look at with this is what is it that's been released? Because I think one of the conversations that isn't being had, and this is a very important point, David, is that post-COVID, people that have even recovered from it have ended up with either long COVID or lung injury. Do you see what I mean? Now, the mandates were one thing, the vaccinations were one thing, and you have to remember, you're talking to people that started at the source of this, isn't it, Maajid? Yeah, at the very, very beginning, looking at what was going on with COVID, looking at what was going on with the vaccinations. But we have to recognize that there's some out there, and we're not talking, remember, we're talking about the fact that from a public health strategy perspective, and as an environment, and I found that interesting that you worked in environmental health, because it looks at things from a systems perspective. The mandates and the vaccinations from a public health perspective were exactly the wrong strategy. More deaths. This was something that bounced from person to person to person, as flus have, and a lot of people recovered from it, but a lot of people were victim to it as
This
well.
is where
So
whatever gets revealed from the lab leaks, so because no one really knows what, there's still a lot of vagary around this, right? So was this a bioweapon? There's also, by the way, a school of thought that says COVID's never been isolated as a virus, and that this is all as a result of the interventions, whether it's the vaccines, the ventilation, the morphine midazolam, even the long-lasting effects. So there's one school of thought that says can be traced to what happens when the vaccines basically damage the immune system and they exacerbate existing but latent illnesses within the body that come to the fore because the vaccination and the spike protein in particular has harmed the immune system. So Mike Yeadon, that I've spoken to multiple times, global head of respiratory illnesses for Pfizer, he now has the view, which is, I got to say openly, is a minority view at the moment, but nevertheless doesn't mean it's definitely wrong. It's just a minority view that there's no such thing as the COVID-19 virus because it hasn't been isolated. However, a lot of people say no, there is something and it's a bioweapon. But who knows? I mean, we're gonna look at this more. One thing Elon's done on Twitter is he's lifted today. Remember, Usman, I said to you today, he's lifted all the restrictions and he's published, probably up by now. He's published Twitter's old policy and why they were banning people. He just dumped it all on Twitter. He's such a in that sense he's a disruptor. So he's taken all their old rules and he just dumped it on Twitter, and as if Twitter's a news agency, said this is what the old rules were and this is what they were doing to you all, because now he owns it. He can do that. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out now that those rules are off, and Twitter today has announced formally that it's no longer policing COVID content at all. Right,
and then
now,
that takes us
start speaking openly about various theories and follow that string to see where it leads. Does it lead because there's a strong group of people that are saying it's going to lead to lab leak, and that's a bioweapon, and it links to biolabs over whatever 2040. There's my light gone off. You see, over 2040 biolabs in Ukraine as well. Link Company, Smartmatic, and all these companies that Hunter Biden was involved in. Sorry, that's the what's it called? Anyway, the name will come to me. But that's one view, and then the other view is no. These are all of these interventions that you mentioned, Usman. They are what have made things worse, including long COVID is a post-viral syndrome. They're saying it was the spike protein and the intervention that has destroyed the immune system. And the more people took, like boosters, the worse that long COVID is going to be, because it's basically a post-viral syndrome like HIV, which has been exacerbated by the jab itself. But this thing, you go down that rabbit hole, it gets really. You got to.
And this is why what I'm saying is that because we're dealing with a problem in a democracy, the consensus perspective. When we come from a point of view of it's all lies, we have to find that middle ground where we can critically think and actually have that revolution, have that point of the people's power. And in order to do that, getting the informed people and understanding the fact that with these pharmaceuticals, if we just look at asthma, for example, one of the things that's proven is that one of the inhalers that people take that has a steroid within it actually makes your lungs reliant upon the inhaler.
Yeah.
So your lungs become reliant upon repetitively taking that inhaler. So what we're looking at is a pharmaceutical industry which is akin to a legalized drug pusher.
Yeah, which is what they are, really, frankly, if you ask me. I mean, they are drug pushers, and the fentanyl crisis in America demonstrates that very, very nicely for us in this point here. But before, David, can I just get back to what you were saying about? So you looking at the deaths, was that a project that was part of the COVID-19 assembly? Was it a project that sits under that?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, we launched a few projects, but it's basically the deaths audit and the whistleblowing were our main things, and then the legal cases as well. Right. So, I mean, just quickly, so when we did the whistleblowing and Sam White came to the fore, I got a contact from a very wealthy donor who said he'd like to get involved, on some level, probably legal. So basically, I introduced him to Francis Horn, Stephen Jackson, and basically we the first thing we did was Stephen Jackson had been working at a basic level on a court case against the against the Emirates' decision to approve the COVID vaccination for children. At that time, it was, I forget, 11 to 15-year-olds or something. But it morphed into old children later on. But so, he'd just been doing the basic work, waiting to get proper funding, because basically you can't do anything unless someone's going to indemnify you against any losses. So basically, I introduced him. And so COVID-19 Assembly became the case holder for that case. The one that was fronted by Beverly Turner, at the judicial review into the MRHA decision. And then 3 other cases. So another one Stephen was doing, and then 2 that Philip Hyland did, based around vaccine mandates and care homes. So there was like a sort of a flurry of activity on court cases, and that was all done by the guy I was able to introduce him to. And, well, basically, it took about a year before our one was eventually, killed off. So nothing happened. But you have to try these things. If we hadn't tried, where would we be? It would be. Imagine they'd got away with it without even anybody taking a case against them. So at least that happened. They're on record. I mean, they're on record as lying, basically, aren't they? In the cases. But and so then, just to get on together, then. So we had the legal cases, and that was it pretty much for COVID-19 Assembly, because Together and mandates and stuff, and then Other Futures taken over. But we are hanging on to the deaths audit and the whistleblowers, because that's going to play in, I think, a lot more in the next year because of Not Our Future. So because I was involved with COVID-19 Assembly, that's why I was in the room the day that Alan Miller sort of called all the groups together, like Us For Them and, everybody, Richard Tyson, Lawrence Fox, and, everybody in one room to see if we could do anything. So Alan's first theory was that we should all message on Twitter the same message, like every Friday, that kind of thing. But I got onto the steering committee, and I thought that, well, my idea was that maybe Together could become what Not Our Future is going to be. So I suggested we call it Together, because we're all working together now, and that we have a declaration.
That was your name, was it? That was your idea.
Yeah.
I tell you, we've got this is the real Kaiser Sosa, man. This is the guy that's all roads lead back to David Fleming when it comes to grassroots activism. Is that what we're hearing, David?
Sort of. It's like an accident. I mean, more like Forrest Gump, isn't it? Because he was the center of everything as well. But no, it was like I've been constantly trying to get this international project going, and so I thought Together would be the next thing that would do that. But yeah, so I proposed we call it Together, have a declaration like the Great Barrington Declaration.
And were you, by the way, before you get to the Great Barrington Delegation, so are you still, is Together still, forgive me for not knowing, I know what Together is, but is it still, as an organization, very much functioning intact and doing things? Or is it, after mandates, it kind of slowed down?
Well, I've got no involvement with Together anymore. So,
okay.
I left a year ago, but all I can say is they talk a lot. They have a thing called Together Talks every month, and it's like a little panel discussion, and that's basically, it seems to be all they do. I don't know what else they do, to be honest. They haven't won, So I do know that we're jumping the gun here a bit, but I do know somebody who was at the last Together Talks, and he said the crowd were getting a bit edgy and almost angry because there was nothing was being done. They were just talking, and they said, well, what are we going to do? What are we actually going to do? That kind of thing. But so my initial plan for Together was, that we do a declaration and work as a group, rather than just, all messaging the same tweet on, every Friday or something. So I was on the steering committee, and we had a vote, and they said, well, okay, we'll do that. So I designed and built the website and did all the, those placards with no vaccine passports, black and white. I made all those and the t-shirts. And so luckily or unluckily, whatever you look at it, the guy who funded the court cases gave me a bit of money to do all that. So I was able to do all those placards and things. And that sort of took us up to November with the NHS and the vaccine mandates and care homes and all that kind of thing. And arguably we helped stop the mandates, coming up to Christmas and that.
Were you part of the delegation that went to Downing Street together?
No, I left in November, sort of towards the end of November, finally. I mean, I sort of decided to leave around October. I wasn't welcome anymore. So basically I left and started working on this.
Are you at liberty to explain why you weren't welcome, or is that just you don't want to go there?
I just say that it's, once I'd done all my creative stuff and got it moving and put some money in and made everything happen, it was like there was no room left for me.
Yeah, I see.
That what you want.
This is why I'm asking, because I'm coming up through, as Usman and I have, coming up through this activism on the community side for a long time in our field and the work we were doing. We've seen a lot of this where things take off and then agendas collide, or directions and opinions about directions collide. But it is sad, because it's a bit like Judean People's Front versus People's Front of Judea. I mean, if we could try as much as possible to work together, I think that's, forgive the pun.
Well, that's the whole point of the word together. That's what I believed in. Having said that, one of the reasons was that, I wanted to go on everything. I wanted to go on net zero, CBDCs, all that stuff. And at that time, Together didn't want to go anywhere. They didn't really want to go beyond passports, vaccine or mandates, and the UK, because I wanted to go.
So you're full on. You wanted to basically expose the whole Great Reset and everything linked to it. So I mean, you're pretty much where we are in that how we view it, right? Which is WEF, Klaus Schwab, and net zero is one element. Vaccine passports and COVID is another. But then there's things like authoritarianism, war on terror, and they all build up to a technocratic autocracy at the top.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, it's a year ago since I started working on this. It's taken ages to get it off the ground. And in that time, a lot of people have started moving on to the Great Reset, since then. Even Together have mentioned it in their last talk. But But basically, I had a plan, and it was based around getting money, which I was sort of probably going to get. And then, to cut the long story short, I didn't get the money, which set my plans back, because I had to work out how to do this without money. So I've spent the last, since March, signing people up to it, and based on almost no money, just like it's just a website really and an idea. But I've got a lot of people to buy into it, so I had to draw a line under it. So I decided to launch, but I pretty much have all the people I wanted, yourself included, as founder signatories. And so I'm happy with that. I mean, going back to, you mentioned Maajid. I mean, Mike and I met in December 2020 at his house in Canterbury, which is near me, to do our first leaflet. So we were going to do the first leaflet together, but we couldn't decide what to do. We just ended up talking about all this stuff, and never got around to it. And that's when I decided, I can't start doing leaflets yet. So we did the debts audit. So it's a long story. But so the idea is that basically we're launched now.
This is now we're on Not Our Future, yeah?
Yeah. So it's taken me quite a while. So, 2022, all I've done is set up basically all these people, the founding signatories, and develop my idea and put in structure in place. So we've got a management system. My plan was to have a much more complicated management system to manage people on the ground, but we've got a system that's good enough, so we can basically manage volunteers. Now, if you look at things that have happened over the last 2 years, other groups that have got people, delivering leaflets or doing local outreach, they haven't been as organized as they could be. I mean, I joined our stand in the park, and some people were delivering leaflets like about a year ago to schools because of the child vax stuff. And But a lot of people were delivering leaflets to the same street because there was no organization. So people, one street had been leafleted 3 times, that kind of thing.
Oh,
and,
wow.
and nobody
That
seemed to
puts
care
people
too
off.
much. Yeah, well, yeah. So most people aren't getting leaflets, and the ones that are getting leaflets are getting fed up. So my plan, I mean, I've got, I can explain the plan to you generally. It's a very simple plan. There's 2 key components which can be broken down, but 2. The first is to get a huge number of people on board and to say, okay, yeah, we want a better future, and we don't want that one, and we trust you to sort of do something. And then there's the action of what we do. Now that's the bit where people like you come in with your people's reset, or Tess Lowry comes in with her like World Council for Health, alternative NHS type things and locally and that kind of thing. So I don't have all the answers. I don't have a manifesto saying this is what we're going to do, because that would be a bit fascist as well, wouldn't it? So I'm just saying we don't want that. We want to go down the road of a better future, and this is how we might start off and show people a few things. And then who knows what the future is going to be like, but the best thing we can do is just walk down towards an optimistic, better future and see what happens, and the public are involved, and it's like a genuine democracy, and people decide, yeah, we like this, and they go that way, and ignore that one, reject the bad one, do your best. Who knows, we mightn't do a good job. At least if we do it ourselves, we've only got ourselves to blame, but we try and do a good one. So that's the idea. So get people in one place on common ground. And so that common ground, instead of like talking about the Great Reset or totalitarianism or COVID or lies or mainstream media, we get people on common ground on a simple binary decision. Do you want a good future for your family or a bad future for your family? And most people are going to say, good future. So that's the common ground. Now, obviously, some people would debate and they say, oh, the world's on fire, we need to do X, Y, and Z, or it'll be a bad future. So obviously, they have to be sort of the ones talked around. So that's where it gets complicated. But so the first step is to get all our sides on ground, on the same ground first, and then from that get volunteers who will then go out and do the actual local outreach. So it's really just the concept is that it's a simple, we don't go out, we don't send strangers out to try and convert entrenched strangers, and have fights and stuff. It will always be people, we want to leverage. I mean, if you could put like a value on trusted relationships, like between you two or whatever, your family, or you and your wife, Maajid, or something like that. I mean, that there's a value in that relationship that exists already. So we want to like leverage that value that's already there. So we want trusted people. We want people to speak to each other who already know each other and trust each other. And that's the angle we're going for.
That's a good idea. So
yeah.
If I've understood you correctly, then this not our future. It's correct. Then you're building a distribution and dissemination network, and you're talking about physical leaflets that go through letterboxes, not emails.
Yeah, physical leaflets. The idea is, I know most leaflets get slung in the bin and ignored. So the idea is we just do it on such a huge scale. Like the goal is every week we'll be putting a leaflet in a door, and everybody get a leaflet every week. And leaflets are very cheap, so it only takes a few people to pay just a few quid each to leaflet an electoral ward, and so it's doable at that level. And the idea is we just sow millions and millions of seeds, and some of those seeds will grow, and if like 80 people throw it in the bin, 20 people glance at it, and 2 people just ask themselves a question saying, oh yeah, that sounds interesting, or I didn't know that. Because I mean I use people I know as examples of intelligent people, educated, who just don't know any of this. They've never heard it. If I mention something to them, they think I'm mad. They haven't heard this anywhere.
Yes, you know what? Because we've all been, and we're actually an example of this on Getter here. Those critical voices, the reason we're on Getter is because we were all being shadow banned on Twitter, right? we've all been corralled into an echo chamber of like-minded people that are critical of all this thing, because what they want us to do is talk to each other, while the majority of people are still not getting access to what we're saying, because we're all in this little corner that they forced us to go, which is why what Elon Musk is now maybe do it, because who knows, maybe what he's trying to do to Twitter is to try and end that policy of segregating us in apps like Getter, so that we can all start speaking to each other again. But can I ask you, David, the leaflets that, can you give us one example of what a typical leaflet could look like? What would it say?
Well, my initial plan was to start off with a booklet that sort of summarized everything, all the main points. And, people like, Mike Eden or Claire Craig or somebody would put their name to different sections. But that became too big a deal to do. So, I mean, everything, just obviously the first couple would be generally about not our future and a rough introduction. I mean, we will never mention the Great Reset or the WEF. Yeah. We will talk about the United Nations, like Agenda 2030, because that's a real thing. That's a real thing that their governments have voted for. They've adopted the resolutions. They've adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. Their representative has done that. So that's not a conspiracy. And so we'll just be looking at everything through the prism of the social development. I keep saying social development. I know it's the Sustainable Development Goals. But things like so that's the first couple of leaflets I envisaged. We haven't done anything concrete yet. It's in the but generally introducing the idea that social development goals are happening. The Agenda 2030 is happening, and you can already see the problems it's causing.
And is this, David? Is this nationwide, or is it focused on major cities?
Oh, it's nationwide. It's it's not. It's global.
Okay. And how have you got so I imagine you have a distribution list for people that are already sympathetic to Not Our Future. How did you get? Is this people that have signed up on the website? Because to get that distribution going across the country, you're going to need an army of volunteers.
Yeah. No, that's the whole idea, is that we just basically get our initial volunteers, and then they go out, and it just goes in a loop. We get a few more volunteers through that, and then it just increases. The idea is that people sign the pledge. So it's based around a pledge. So people sign a pledge, and the pledge is basically rejecting the bad future and pledging that they will help work towards a better future, whatever that is, and however small the steps. And even we don't lay it out too much in detail, but I mean, if you read the pledge, but it's anything, even just not making it difficult for other people, like if you put barriers up for people to work towards a better future, then that would be bad. So just people who might put barriers up, if they just stop doing that and make it easier for people. So you don't actually have to, take definite steps yourself, as long as you just make it easier for other people to do it. But the idea is that the pledge is to work towards a better future and reject the bad future. So people who sign the pledge, we get in touch with them and ask, do you want to be a volunteer, to work towards, locally on outreach. I mean, a lot of people are already in Stand the Park or the Yellow Boards and, the Great Reopening that's in the UK. So from there, we have our volunteers to go out on the ground, and then hopefully that will increase the number of people who sign the pledge, and then that will increase the number of people who volunteer, and it just goes from there. So hopefully it will just grow and grow.
And what's the structure like then? Who chooses what leaflet goes out when and where, and which campaigns to adopt, which things to decry in the leaflets? You mentioned, for example, Agenda 2030, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It could be CBDCs, it could be net zero targets.
Yeah.
Who is the what's the structure? What does the organization look like?
Well, strictly speaking, it's really just me at the moment, and people who are helping me. Yeah. So I mean, I learned from Together with COVID-19 Assembly. I was able to do everything as according to plan, because it was just me and then people who were helping. Together was a committee, and I don't want to work in a committee again. Not at the moment.
I understand that.
Yeah. And so I'm back to just being me basically, and advisors and helpers and mentors.
Look, if I can advise you,
Yeah,
very few things happen by committee.
yeah. Well, I've always known that. I mean, I knew because I was always big into Formula One. You know, I worked in it for a while, and all the top teams during the 80s and 90s were run by one person, more or less. You know, Frank Williams, you know, Ron Dennis from McLaren. It was always the joke that Ferrari spent 20 years without winning a title because they were basically a committee. They were run a corporate structure and decisions didn't get made, or if they were made, they were political. You know, it's like, oh, I don't want to upset the board because blah, blah. So Ferrari spent 20 years, 21 years before they won a championship again. And eventually they discovered give one man control, you know, that was it.
The thing
so
is,
yeah,
what is because I don't know how you're probably our age, right, David? How old are you?
Yeah, 56.
Right, you're gonna definitely. You're older than us. You're gonna definitely remember the days in Britain where bright orange Khilafah stickers went up all over the country. I'm talking around 90 before the Wembley Arena Caliphate conference organised by Hizb ut-Tahrir, which had 12,000 people in it. We went on a campaign putting up these bright orange stickers that said the Khilafah or Caliphate coming soon to a country near you. Don't know if you remember those, Usman. But the reason I mention that is because it was forget the idea, the cause, right? I mean, we're not trying to turn Britain into a caliphate, but the reason I mention it is the organizational structures and the ability to disseminate and get these things out there. Whether it was the posters, we call it flyering and postering, the old way of doing things, which in the old days before the internet, the SWP, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Anti-Nazi League, they all used to do this, is a grassroots leaflet distribution and fly posting. So we used to do that as Islamists, as Hizb ut-Tahrir. So the reason I mention this is because from experience, I can pretty much, like what you just said, that you need, in terms of to get things done, logistically, there needs to be a decision structure, which is what it sounds like you've understood already. And that way, when you collaborate with others, so if Usman and I want to come to you and say, right, we've got this idea, which I'm going to ask Usman to elaborate on in a bit, of a people's reset, you can say, right, I've got a distribution and dissemination network. I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to collaborate with you. If I like your idea, I will, bring on board my distribution network, but it's still something under your remit, so that if you choose to do it, you choose to do it. It works with something else. But that way, the people who have signed up, of course, they remain signed up to anything, the direction of which they like. But you can't have a direction if you've got too many chefs attempting to spoil the broth. So I think that you're right to try and keep it very focused and lean, and its decision-making abilities, focused on just really getting the job done. But I think that maybe what you're describing, I think that it might be an opportunity, Usman, because what we've just heard there, it's really interesting that David's landed on Warrior Creed at this time, because and this wasn't planned. But Usman and I, for a while, have been talking about the need to record a people's reset, the need at a grassroots level to start organizing communities, to start advocating for positive activism and solutions to the problems that many of us are now sensing and hence speaking about on shows like this. So what I think is actually you're describing with that dissemination network dovetails really nicely with what we've been trying to speak about so far, not do, but we're going to do, hopefully, inshallah, we're going to do, is the people's reset idea. Because what we're looking at is that there are, and we've mentioned it a bit on this show before, and we had the Bitcoin guys on as well, that there's people worried about the CBDC angle. There's people worried, like Lois Perry, who was on Warrior Creed, worried about the COP, she's from COP26, and they're worried about the net zero angle. There's people worried about, foreign wars and that angle, right? And how money laundering gets involved in all these foreign wars and all this stuff. So basically, if we can somehow recognize that all these are very valid things, that when you look at the Great Reset agenda, they do connect up to that as well. If we can then start saying, okay, this is what everything we oppose, and all these people in these fields that oppose it, if we can bring them under some form of initiative to say, and what can we work towards? Now, these things by definition will always ever be coalitions, but if you have a strong dissemination and distribution network, you can really create impact on those grassroots and get those ideas out there. It sounds to me like what you're setting up would work really, really well with this People's Reset idea. What do you think, Usman? I want to throw it to you.
Yeah, well, what we've got with this is the interesting point is look at the catalyst that brought you into this, David, which was you're looking at environmental change. Now, how much information? Now, what I'm getting into with this is there's the subjective catalysts that get us into activism. Yeah. But those subjective catalysts that get us into activism, how much information do we have to negate or go against what we're going against? Yeah. Now, the reason I'm making that point is when we're talking about valid activism, yeah, valid activism is different to an exoteric payback by being part of a group. So if I'm part of a group, I get the payback, like probably with Together, they got through most of their budget with boxes of Fox's biscuits and a coffee machine, and they sat there and planned. And you were sitting there thinking to yourself, well, I don't want to be turning up to a meeting where we're just eating biscuits, drinking coffee, and pretending to plan something. Do you see what I mean? That what we get with this is when you talk about circle of influence, meaning the circle that you can actually influence change within, and then what you're concerned about. So there might be the thing over there, which is the end point. So if we're talking about, like you just said, with the Great Reset, you're saying we don't want to talk about the Great Reset. We don't want to talk about the World Economic Forum. But then it comes down to, okay, what is your mission and vision? Now, coming back to what we're talking about with the People's Reset idea, the concept that one of our boys the other day talked about, Maajid, about the physical newspaper.
Yeah.
That would be put out. And then we met
See,
David.
all of this connects, doesn't it?
Yeah, it all connects.
Yeah.
But what it comes down to...
Remind me, who was it we were talking to about that, Usman?
Who was it that...
The newspaper.
Talked about the newspaper.
Yeah. Or where was it? What, just like context? I'll remember who it was if you remind me where it was.
It was at Ubble's restaurant.
Tiff.
Give a shout out to Tiffin's in
Cannon Street,
Whitechapel. Where's it? Cannon Street. Is it
Cannon Street Road? Cannon Street Road in Whitechapel.
Cannon Street Road.
David, we'll take you there for a curry one day. Don't worry.
Yeah. I've worked in Tower Hamlets a couple of times. So
yeah. Go on, Usman. Carry on.
The thing that this comes down to, David, is actually being able to bring proper positive activism down to that street level and not over systemizing it as well, because what you're looking at with this is tapping into the audience that's already looking for activism. You have to remember that the cognitive shift post-COVID, that candle that's been lit, can burn out very quickly. And the reason it can burn out very quickly is because people want normality. They just want, they want permanence. They want simplicity. People aren't interested in being controversial. So what we have to bring to them is things that they're concerned about. You have to remember, as much as we've been lied to about COVID, we were lied to about weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And once we start unraveling that ball of wool, depending on how much you want to go and look into the information, because there's the idea of being educated, and there's a point I made the other day. I said that general knowledge is just another word for general ignorance. Yeah. So general knowledge is just another word for general ignorance.
I agree with that.
Yeah, well, it's one of our. I think we came up with. I think we came up with the saying, Maajid. So it's one of our Warrior Creed sayings. So, but the point being with this, that you have to remember this system, the education system has taught you what you want and then asked you to vote. Yeah? Taught you what you want and then asked you to vote. Even with the climate change controversy, if we want to talk about it from that point of view, we would have to get climate change experts to look at the subject and go, okay, what is actually happening? But when you have a mission and vision perspective of, okay, where are we being lied to within the entire system? Where is our general knowledge being used against us? Then you get to the point of circle of influence. And what that means is there is multiple contributing factors towards why we have got to this very point. Does that make sense? Why is it that we're always retreading the ground of victimhood, whether it's racism, we've had sexuality introduced, we're moving on to other individualized factors here. We don't want to be the victims of that same phenomenon when we start looking at this and go, okay, it's a great idea, but mobilizing an idea is something different. Yeah, like the general just underneath me here, there, the general there, we call him the general because, and I'm not hyping my boy over here, but I am hyping my boy because we're like Wu-Tang, Maajid. They can't rap like us. But the point being that when you analyze something, it has to, remember, you're a public health environmental man, David, which means you're trained in systems thinking. Yeah? So the public health perspective looks at how is this going to affect the system? Yeah? It's taking that very thinking to this whole phenomenon. And what I'm saying to you here, David, is once again, we get back to general knowledge. The only reason 67% of humanity locked themselves down was because the general level of knowledge was enough to create fear. Yep. I have to tap into you to create fear. I have to give you an idea of yourself, a false sense of confidence within your general knowledge. Because this is the funny thing, isn't it? You can ask me about, oh, Usman, how do I make a pizza? Confident enough to pick this up and go to a YouTube video. I feel like I'm empowered. But then as soon as I feel like I don't know, I feel afraid. Yeah, there's an analogy that's given that if you're sitting around a campfire, it illuminates what's around you, but then what it doesn't illuminate, when you look out from the campfire, you see complete darkness. You won't even see a glimmer of light because the campfire, you'll only get what the campfire illuminates. And that's what your general knowledge is. So the catalyst for your activism was
so
still
this is even referred to as, Usman, this is referred to as Jahl Murakkab by some of the traditional jurists within the Islamic tradition, Jahl Murakkab, which means compounded ignorance.
Compounded ignorance, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of trusting in the sun to illuminate. Yep. So these are, it can sound like we're using spiritual language, but we're not. This is actually what Eastern psychology, Eastern philosophical stances have been based upon. Because the problems we get to today, which we're going to cover after this, are based exactly on the fact that we've been generally educated to be manipulated.
So, Usman, can I ask you then, on this premise, how do you see what David's saying, working with what you and I have been talking about together, and also with some others on this show in previous episodes, and we're calling the People's Reset. How do you see this panning out? Because actually, as we brainstorm this live on live streams, people watching will also have ideas. Some of them may go and join up Not Our Future. Others will, write in on the comments thread or whatever, get in touch with us and say, we think this. So at this stage, because we haven't actually, and obviously Christmas is coming, we're going to wait till the new year, but we haven't laid any groundwork, though we are in the process of doing so. And we've spoken to people, including, by the way, David, donors who are expressing interest in this idea as well, the People's Reset idea. But while we're still brainstorming it, I think it would be nice to, if you explain a bit about, Usman, what you think needs to be done in terms of a People's Reset, what you were saying to the Bitcoin guys when they were on here as well, and then we can try and see how what David's trying to work on can overlap with it.
Well, exactly that point about the general knowledge aspect. If we bring, when we bring a group of experts together, so people with experience in their field and that are knowledgeable in their field to deliver the information from their field. So what we're not doing with this is bringing in passionate lunatics. Someone who wants to be part of a cause, wants to go in and shout, because when we talk about conspiracy theory, the whole point of conspiracy theory with this is you're going out and you're shouting fire when there is no fire. But what we get with this is we get experts in there, or let me rephrase that. We get problem solvers in their specific fields to talk, and then from a systems perspective, you bring it together. So what you have is you have different forms of activism that people can get involved within, depending on whatever their catalyst is. If it's environmental change, we have people that are experts in activism within what's going on with the environment. And what ends up happening with that is when those activists go out, the next time we have a live event, we're more informed. So it's a constantly evolving process. Because you have to remember that we've got this fourth industrial revolution where when I press a button, the information goes around the world. And we spent the last decade and a half informing governments, training staff, as well as working right down at the grassroots. And understanding that you're dealing with different stratas of society, and the great power that we have when you're dealing with people on a collective physical level is that you can bring groups together that are no longer, you don't have that intersectional identity when you're standing in front of an individual. You only have that intersectional identity when your interaction is spaced out between maybe the forums you're on the internet, maybe the debates you're having at a community event. But when you start when you start gelling people together on collective activism, you're going to see something special happen with this.
David, are you okay for time, by the way?
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
We've been talking for an hour, but I feel we've got a bit more in us. So if you're okay,
well, I think we've got the other subjects. We've got some important subjects to
absolutely
cover from a news perspective as well.
Yeah, and we'll address those as well. David, on this idea of not our future and what to do, and the positive activism we can associate and the People's Reset. So one idea I'll throw up just here while we're talking about it is this idea of there's this link to CBDCs. There's this growing trend for small businesses to abolish cash and take card-only payments, contactless payments only, and not take any cash. Right now, I don't think that's a good idea because it normalizes the phasing out of cash. Once you phase out cash, eventually, as Rishi Sunak we know wants to do, You remove it altogether, replace it with central banking digital currencies, and the total control mechanism is there. And that's it. We're stuck. We are permanent serfs ad infinitum. So this sort of phenomenon of some small businesses in neighborhoods saying we're card only, not cash only, we're card only. Yeah. If, for example, and again, this is all subject for debate, but if, for example, the People's Reset takes a view that any business that says that they will accept cash, right, whether it's cash only or cash and card, we will support in communities. Any business that says card only, we're not going to do anything. We personally just won't support them. We will go to businesses that at least as one element of payment have the facility to receive cash. Now, what that does is, because there are many businesses, especially those that are on the smaller side, founded by families in communities, so family businesses, relatively recent migrant arrivals and their children and their businesses. A lot of these businesses, you would have seen them, whether they're barbers, Usman, you would have seen them as well. They say, oh, cash only, right? And the reason they say cash only is multiple, but one of them is because there's a charge every time you do a card transaction. And that charge on every transaction for a small family business that's struggling in a local neighborhood, a hairdresser, like a barber, one guy in a chair, right? That makes the difference to whether he has a dessert that evening or has to, skim because he's not earning enough because everything is inflation's going up and he's basically struggling to make ends meet. It makes them, that's why some of them say cash only, because they don't want to pay the additional transaction fee on card payments. Now, these small businesses are very vulnerable, right? So if we understand that they're vulnerable in the first place, all these new, and let's call it, for want of a better phrase, gentrifying businesses that come into neighborhoods and do card only, and they look nice and plush with their lights and stuff, right? Yes, it's convenient, but it's very short-term thinking. I imagine you both agree. It's very short-term thinking, because if you normalize the phasing out of cash and everything becomes electronic transfers, then think Canada, think Netherlands, think PayPal and freezing people out their accounts. It becomes very easy to then control financial transactions if everything is digital. So this could be an example among many examples where communities, whether they're pubs, hairdressers, whether they're cafes, if they resist this card-only trend, which during COVID, by the way, if you remember, because the excuse was cash could give you COVID because people are touching it. So everyone was saying do card only. So this is a separate push. If, for example, the grassroots network activism, Not Our Future, basically in a neighborhood could even highlight businesses that continue to take cash or encourage people to support such businesses. This is a kind of thing where there's a direct positive action that we're encouraging people to do. And the longer people transact and use cash, the longer it will last, which means we get that time frame, the longer space that we as a country, as citizens get to continue saying we don't want CBDCs. And while we're holding that, a bit like in Game of Thrones, we're holding that door from collapse, and it's like, hold the door, hold the door, hold the door. We don't want CBDCs. The longer cash is alive, the more strength we'll have to hold that door until a solution is proposed. And I say solution because cash, as valuable as it is to resist CBDCs, is losing value in itself because of runaway inflation and the suicidal policies like furlough, like universal basic income, that people like Rishi Sunak are either supporting or, in the case of UBI, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer is encouraging him to support. So that's one practical example, but I think it's an example of not what we don't want, but what we do want, i.e. keep cash alive. That could be the phrase, for example, keep cash alive. And it could be, that the People's Reset has people that are supportive of this because they don't like CBDCs. And then the Not Our Future network has this dissemination network that agrees, we need to keep cash alive. And so multiple things can come from that. Like, for example, local businesses highlighted on the leaflet. These are your businesses that still take cash or, take both card and cash. I don't know what you think of that, but I mean, this is all up for debate. This is just an idea.
Yeah, well, that was exactly one of the things that we were thinking about doing when we have a large number of people on board. Then we could use it to. I mean, there's loads of examples, but one would be to patronize businesses that use cash and to boycott businesses that don't use cash. So exactly as you said, And like if we had, I mean, just say extreme example or an optimistic example, we had half the people in a local authority area, like half the people in Camden, were on our side. I mean, you know, you could just I mean, I don't want to say it, but you could destroy a business if they were if they were a local company and they were insisting on not using cash. They, I mean, they wouldn't be destroyed because they'd know after about 3 days to bring cash back in, wouldn't they? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, so it would, yeah. So, and if you had that going on at a national scale everywhere, then it would, you know, it would stop cash being, you know, destroyed. But you can do the same thing again, like test lorry with, you know, like setting up local independent health, you know, systems like the national health system was before it was the NHS. You know, just independent hospitals all around the country, organised by, you know, people paying dues or benevolent donors. You know, if that was the case, if you had hospitals like that popping up, and you could get people to go there instead of going to the NHS, you know, and you know, patronize them that way, make them work. And also, I'm linked to an independent local community bank network that are starting up. You know, it's a startup. It's a fintech startup, but they want Richard Werner is involved with them. You know, the German economist. They want to have like local banks, but doing proper local banking stuff. You know, like giving loans to people locally, and the people pay into them, and it's a proper old-fashioned bank, like it was, like it should be. You know, like not the way banks are now. And then if we had a huge number of people signed up, we could get people to move to those banks, move to a local community bank that's doing good in their area, you know, like giving their local plumber a loan of £50,000 to start up, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Real stuff. So yeah, I mean, if we had all that going, we had people, and then not to mention how we could influence actual voting and, you know, parties and, you know, putting pressure on parties, that kind of thing. If we had enough people on board, you know, we could do things, you know, we could make things happen. But I do want to sort of still focus on just getting people on board on a simple cause, like a better future.
As you should, because all these
Yeah.
ideas would be things that you could collaborate with others on once this is up and running. You know,
Yeah,
like if I said, listen, David, here's an idea like a leaflet, cash is king, and little bullet points, you'd be able to say, yeah, I think that's something that that Not Our Future would come on board with to help to the neighborhoods. But it would have to be something that, you know, people that are interested in this find common cause with your people that are volunteering for what you're interested in, and it would work as a collaboration while you maintain your hierarchy of decision making within Not Our Future, because you do need to be able to make agile decisions and sometimes say no when you need to say no.
Yeah. I mean, that's very important. And I mean, like the People Assembly thing. I mean, that's the People Assembly. I mean, the People's Reset. The trouble is, you know, the way what could happen if we start getting traction on local communities, then there's already a growing, you know, interest in it from, you know, our overlords, is like local people's assemblies, you know, where the people decide, but, you know, they don't decide, you know, they're controlled by the government, but that can be pawned off as, say, oh, it's a grassroots thing, as the people are deciding themselves. Because do you remember about a year ago, they had a people's assembly for like climate, you know, for net zero. And it's presented as, oh, the people are deciding. So what it was, first of all, the remit was completely fixed. Basically, it was the remit for the people. So they got 100 people at random or from around the country, all different types of people in a room, and they were going to decide about, you know, net zero. But they were told, the decision was, okay, you have to tell us what we do to make sure net zero works. You know, it wasn't whether we need net zero or not. So instantly it was fixed. But then they also brought in David Attenborough's wheeled in to talk to the 100 people. I'm sure he gave a very emotive speech and like pulled at all the heartstrings. So before you know it, they rubber stamp that we have to do X, Y, and Z, exactly what the government wanted anyway for net zero. And they can rubber stamp it as the public have decided and they want net zero and they want X, Y, and Z, you know. So we have to watch out for that, just in case people start thinking, oh, it's already being taken care of. The government are going to do that. We're going to have grassroots, local community people deciding for themselves. But absolutely, I mean, I'm sure you probably both agree, maybe, but literally, not one single thing the government can do is going to help us in the future. It's all absolutely all, rubbish.
Well, listen, I frankly, it's captured. So there's no forget whether or not they can do anything. In principle, if you're captured, you don't want to work with a captured entity. So we've got to start again from the grassroots upwards.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can I, before we move on, because we want to address some current affair topics as well. You're welcome to remain with us, David, but they're topics that are in your face, so it's up to you. But Balenciaga is one of the topics we're going to discuss on what's going on. I don't know if you followed that, but it's quite scary.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I've been all over that for about 13, 14 years.
Oh, okay, great. We're going to get to
that's
before we do.
Yeah.
Before we do, just if you want, then summarize for people before we move to the Balenciaga topic and others. Summarize for people then. Where do they find Not Our Future? What do they need to do? How do they find you? And then we'll move to the next topic.
Yeah, well, I mean, very simply, it's notourfuture.org. I mean, at the moment, I'm just looking at people who are already on our side. I'm not trying to convert anybody yet. The website doesn't have anything about changing people's minds. We want to sign up everybody who's already on our side. So if you want to get involved, either just as helping out on the ground as a volunteer, delivering leaflets, being a local manager, or even just being there so we can send you an email to say, please share this tweet or something, just having our own 77th, what did you call it? 77th Brigade. So just go on the website, sign the pledge. There's a volunteer form on the website as well. So it's a separate form if you want to be a volunteer. And that's it really. Just basically sign the pledge and spread the word. Tell everybody you know. If anybody you know who's already on our side, we're not asking you to go out and convert people. Just spread the word with people already on our side. Get us all in one place, and then we can go out and sort of get more people to join on gradually, one by one. I mean, I do want to. A good summary of what we're about is, I've got it written up here somewhere. The book by Charles Mackay, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, where he says that people go mad in groups or go mad in herds, but they recover their senses slowly, one by one. So I want to sort of Not Our Future to become the thing that organizes that one by one and wakes people up one by one, and we make sure it happens by sort of organizing it and getting it. So we don't want it to rely on it to happen on its own, because it's not going to happen on its own. It could happen on its own in 50 years or 100 years, but we want it to happen now. So that's basically it. So just people, notourfuture.org, get on, sign the pledge, spread the word, and let's all just get together and then start making things happen.
And we assure everyone watching and everyone listening that Warrior Creed and my bro Usman and I, we're going to follow up with David. We'll probably grab you, David, and take you down to Tiffin's in Whitechapel and have some food and follow up and chat, because I feel we can work closely together. What we want to do with gathering a bunch of voices and start looking at positive solution proposals as well via the People's Reset. So we've got a lot to go forward and collaborate on. So that's great.
And rebuilding the community aspect with this, because I think really the thing that's missing there, David, is, I don't know if I'm picking it up in a wrong way, but what you're talking about when you're even talking about the local banking is returning to a more community-based perspective. Yeah. So where you had, I remember when you used to have the independent bakery, you used to have the independent grocers, and then the monopolization that came in with these hypermarkets like Asda and Lidl and everything else. Now, what we're talking about with this is personal concern, and human beings are a social animal that connects with, and common concern is a great way to connect people. That's the power. That's the power you've got, which is the common concern. So not so much for just on a level of mobilizing people to hand out a leaflet or do anything like that, but even to sit down, have a cup of tea, and then go and out some leaflets to connect. Because the word community is quite an interesting word, because com means unity and unity means unity. So it's unity. So the idea here about getting people to connect.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is the thing here, because we can be confident when we're putting something across that's planned, but you have to remember that people are mobilizing. The people on the other side are mobilizing that very same tool. You have to remember that we wouldn't have had Brexit if it wasn't for the mobilization of the middle to working class, which previously wasn't seen as beneficial from a voting perspective. But when the sophistry was used in a different way to mobilize that part of the community to get the numbers up, for whether you agree with Brexit or whether you disagree with it isn't the point. But the point is the mobilization of the people through common concern. And the thing with this is, David, is we've been behind the veil with what happens in the government. So the idea of having agreed to a consensus means that they'll make moves that will affect you at the bottom. So what you need to be able to do is change that consensus and force change.
Yeah.
And that means it has to come from the people.
It has to. Now, guys, I'm going to gently move it to Balenciaga because we're running out of time, and it's important as a topic to address its current. Now, you guys probably been following, but Balenciaga fashion brand has basically deleted all of their social media accounts, whether on Facebook or Instagram, after the scandal around the children in their fashion shoots that were in, to put it mildly, they were in sexually suggestive environments, which is, and I'm talking very, very young children, with provocative and what could only have been deliberately provocative clues left in the photo shoots, in which hints were being made about child sexual exploitation and glorifying it, including, by the way, open court documents that were visible in the photos that were about people that had been convicted for child sexual exploitation, while books that were fetishizing or eroticizing child sexual exploitation were also visible in the shots. Balenciaga, when the scandal kicked off, blamed their photographer. Anyone who knows anything about photo shoots knows that the photographer turns up to a set that's already prepared and starts shooting. So the photographer wasn't the one that asked the children to be in those suggestive poses or had those books and papers littered around with an empty wine glass and a very young girl lying as if she was an adult girl with an empty wine glass next to her. The photographer should have walked away, by the way, so they're not scot-free. The photographer, the minute they saw that set, should have said, I'm participating in this, and walked away. But Balenciaga's attempt to scapegoat the photographer is a scapegoat, and people weren't falling for it. And Balenciaga shut all their accounts down. I imagine their business is going to suffer, and they deserve to. But one thing that's interesting with this is, well, there's a few things. The first thing that's interesting with this is that the collaboration was with Adidas, or Adidas, as we say in England, but Americans say Adidas. The collaboration was with Adidas, and Adidas seems to have got off scot-free, and nobody's blaming them. But the book that was seen to be eroticizing and fetishizing or glorifying child sexual exploitation, the shoot in which that book was visible was the Adidas collaboration shoot with Balenciaga. Now, there's another very interesting thing, Usman. You're going to like this because of some of the conversations we've had in the past. One of the things that was visible in one of the shoots was a tape, a reel of tape with writing on the tape, and the shoot deliberately displayed the word in the reel of tape. The word Balenciaga on that tape was misspelled Baal-Enciaga, so Baal, and Baal is this ancient Babylonian god of child sacrifice. So the entire thing is really weird, but I believe it's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the fashion industry. Let's not forget that the head of, when it comes to fashion, the head of elite management models, right? He was Epstein. What I mean by that is because he was an associate of Epstein, he got arrested, he was in prison in France, and before he could go to trial, decided to suicide himself in jail, just like Epstein did. So we've got a few people like this that are in the fashion industry that have now recently been either convicted or Epsteined. And now we see this Balenciaga shoot. And the last thing I'll say that I find very interesting with this is that Balenciaga, nor Adidas, nor any of the models or celebrities that support them, you're going to notice a lack of condemnation, by the way. None of them have had their bank accounts cancelled, which is, interesting because you get people for saying far, far less and doing far, far less, have their PayPal frozen, have their accounts shut down. But Balenciaga, voluntarily, they shut their own social media accounts down because they were running from the criticism. But no bank or PayPal version of financial institution has come along and said, right, because you guys are glorifying child sexual exploitation, we're going to shut your accounts down. And so really, it is up to people to express their concern around what's going on with these sorts of photo shoots. And I imagine people are already, you're going to see an effect in their sales, not because the kind of people that care about this are buying Balenciaga. None of us three have ever, I imagine, bought Balenciaga goods. But if somebody walked into a room now wearing Balenciaga, people like us three would say, why are you wearing that? Why are you endorsing something that engages in child sexual exploitation in their photo shoots? And it's that kind of backlash that even people that do buy Balenciaga would probably fear and wouldn't want to continue shopping there. So I imagine and hope it is going to affect their bottom line. But this is where we are. We're in a situation where child exploitation is openly being boasted about in a context where nobody has ever been convicted for what Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted for, which was trafficking children to who? Who are her clients? Where are the people that this is the first case in history where somebody has been trafficked. Somebody has been convicted for trafficking girls to nobody.
Mm-hmm.
Where are all the Johns? And we know where they are. We know that because we've got Epstein's flight logs. The Johns, the people that are on Epstein's flight logs, people multiple times that went to his island, right, the Epstein Island, are people like Bill Clinton, people like Bill Gates, whose wife divorced him and said, I'm divorcing Bill Gates because of his associations with Epstein after Epstein killed himself in jail, right? So we know who they are because even his own bloody wife is saying, I don't want to be with this guy anymore because he was too close to Epstein to a point that it disgusted me. She said that on TV. So we all know who the clients are, but none of them have ever been convicted. And I think the only way we're going to force through some change here is precisely by the kind of grassroots disgust at what happened with the Balenciaga shoot and such a huge backlash that Balenciaga had to shut all their accounts down. David, you said you've been following this for a while.
Well, as part of my sort of awakening, during the noughties, probably. I went down that rabbit hole basically of the satanic stuff, and probably through David Icke and people like that, maybe.
Yeah.
But I've kept sort of in touch with it through. There's a website called VigilantCitizen.com. Have you ever heard of that?
No. What does it do?
I mean, it's basically, I don't know who he is, or who they are, but basically they analyze all these satanic photo shoots. The obvious one eye stuff. So
Yeah.
he'll have a section on all the one eye, all the fashion shoots, and it's nearly always the top music acts and the top fashion.
Yeah.
And and people around the fringe, and actors, top Hollywood actors, and the one eye stuff. But that's the easy stuff, is the one eye stuff. But then it's all the literally. I mean, I've been looking at these sort of photo shoots, that the Balenciaga one, for 10 years. I mean, loads of companies do it. I mean, there's loads. If you go back through history, that lots of them do it. It's not unusual. So when I first became aware of this a few days ago, I just thought it was another one, the usual stuff. And I was surprised it got traction. Was it Kanye West who sort of made this sort of happen a bit more? It was something to do with him, wasn't it?
Yeah, so Kanye, so here's another element to it. You mentioned Kanye. I mean, again, I want to emphasize Kanye's language. I'm not too keen on the way he describes. It's a category error. Look, let me explain this again. I do it every time. It's important. There is a correlation, say, between Muslims and terrorism. There's a correlation recently in that a lot of the people that were allegedly involved in terrorist attacks happened to be Muslim. But that doesn't mean I then say Muslims are terrorists, even though that correlation exists. Right?
Well, I had that well with the Irish, the 80s and 90s. Yeah.
And it's why we through Usman and I in our background, were attempting to inject nuance into that debate. And some of it succeeded, some of it didn't. But we were also looking for a language that would distinguish Islam and Muslims from those that did engage in terrorism in the name of Islam, even though clearly they were appropriating or hijacking it. But take that analogy. It's why I'm saying it's a category error. Because just because we observe a correlation doesn't mean we should then use a generalization language to describe what is a correlation and not a causation. So with that caveat aside, I'm skeptical of Kanye's language. But with that caveat aside, you're right, David. He did get involved. And the reason is because his ex-wife and the mother of his children, what's her name, Kim Kardashian, she's heavily involved with Balenciaga and other fashion shoots, and she hasn't come out and condemned any of this. And again, back to that point, Kanye had all his bank accounts shut down for saying something silly. Nobody has done anything to Balenciaga. None of their accounts have been shut down.
So, yeah, but it was, I think it was his involvement that made this stick, because usually these, I mean, if you go to vigilantcitizen.com and they'll have their pictures of the month. And if you just go back in time and look at all the pictures of the month over the last, I don't know how far you can go back now, but I've been looking at them for over 10 years. It's all these sort of photo shoots, Yeah. I mean, obviously 95% of them are these satanic photo shoots. It's just crazy, really. But they're usually adults, But then there are plenty of them that have kids in them as well. And so when I saw this one, I just thought it was the usual stuff, the satanic crap that, for whatever reason, they want this to be public. But then it got traction because of Kanye, and that's what made it stick. And then they do all the backtracking. And putting the blame on the photographer. I mean, this would be an established photographer who does all these sort of shoots, and an established designer who does all, and we know her name, but I forget it. So this would have been signed off from the top. The photographer and the designer would have done all this together. They knew exactly what was going on. They did it to a brief, and it was the usual stuff. There was no accident. They're obviously backpedaling now because it got traction. Because usually this stuff goes under the radar. I mean, look at everything that Madonna and people do. At the Super Bowl. In the middle of the Super Bowl. These events. They're always like, for the last 20 years, they've been just satanic stuff. It's just it's always about the devil and all this stuff. And nobody ever mentions it. You never see a newspaper headline saying Madonna was dressed as the devil, or Madonna kissed the devil during the Super Bowl. They don't say that. They just say, "Oh, didn't she look great? It was funny," or whatever. And that's what's been going on with the kids stuff as well. It's just people's just been ignoring it. It never gets any traction. The newspapers would never mention it on a Monday morning if there was a fashion show with some kid naked or something. I mean, who knows? Because because I don't know how far you go into the whole occult satanic stuff. I mean, Andrew Tate did a good piece on it the other day. About...
Well, because I know Usman does quite a lot, and so, but before I get into that, I just want to you mentioned the one eye thing a couple of times. It's very interesting because Usman, you will know this, that there are multiple hadith references about the one eye, which is very interesting because it's something that our tradition has been discussing for a long time. But how is that all relevant to? I mean, why this obsession with this one eye and all these fashion shoots? Because David's right, it is there. It's ever present, you know.
Because the one eye concept refers to, it's actually a Middle Eastern concept that refers to lack of depth perception. So the idea that you see something externally. So when we talk about the word philia, to love, yeah. So we say, okay, pedophilia is understood as love of children, but relates to consumption. So anything you love, you're consuming. Yeah. Which once again, if I said, if I used another word, if I was a rosophilia, for example, yeah, I'm making a word up now, but someone who loved roses, by the end of my indulgence in loving roses, there'd be no rose bushes alive because I would have
You're
plucked
consuming them
every
all.
rose. Yeah.
Here is before you. Here is the. I just want you to see this, David, because our tradition. So this is a saying of the Prophet. It's called a hadith, yeah, and it's in Bukhari, which is a established mainstream traditional collection of hadith, right? And it's there that the Antichrist, or ad-Dajjal in Arabic, is a one-eyed liar, you know, and the Arabic there everyone can see next to the English translation with all the reference. Sahih Bukhari, number 7131, book 92, hadith number 78. And the wording there, ما بعث النبي إلا أنذر أمة الأعور الكذاب, that the Prophet was not sent except to warn his people about the lying one-eyed person, or the A'war al-Kadhab, which means lying one-eyed person. So it's there in the tradition. It's quite established. And Usman, you're saying that how does that relate to this philia point you're making?
Okay. So what it relates to is, if I always use the analogy when we're doing this, whether teaching within a group or a singular intervention, I use the analogy of a tiger, because a tiger is something that when you look at, you see its beauty, you see its majesty, you see its ferocity and strength. But it takes a certain amount of acres of forest to have a tiger. The tiger's the apex predator. It's like the crowning of the forest. So they did an experiment where people in Singapore were shown a photo of a jungle with a tiger in it. And I said, what can you see? I said, oh, we see the trees, we see some leaves, we see a tiger. But they saw the image collectively. Yeah. The tiger was part of the forest. Then people in Los Angeles were shown exactly the same photo, and they just saw the tiger, which talked about atomized perception. Now, what it talks about with this is, if I'm looking at the tiger, each human being will recognize the awesomeness, the majesty, the power, the beauty. Now, if I'm looking at that tiger from a collective perspective, I can look and say, okay, it's beautiful, and that's the experience. That sense of awe is the divine experience of that tiger and then the environment around it. Or if I come from a philia perspective and I want to consume, I'm going to pull out my rifle, shoot the tiger, skin it, wear it as a jacket, and think I've taken the tiger. Now, it's a very interesting point with this, because what it talks about is, it talks about the disconnection between us as part of the reality around us, part of as an earthling, which is very easy to demonstrate if I use a crocodile, for example. If I take a crocodile, the crocodile needs the water, but it also needs to come out of the water to warm itself in the sun. So it's part of its environment. It is part and parcel of its environment, cannot survive independently of its environment. Yeah. But the human being, from a Eurocentric philosophical perspective, without us unraveling all of it, if you look at Descartes' understanding, where Descartes saying that the subject object understanding, where there's a concept here of that the human being can, the individual can reason. But you have to remember, you were taught what is reasonable. You've been taught the value of each thing. And if you don't understand the value of each thing, you might end up like the colonists who went into certain areas and started planting wheat and destroyed the local ecosystem, or introduced chickens or cows and destroyed the local ecosystem. Because what ends up happening is that when you come in from an objective perspective, you don't see the entire system. Yeah. But also from an objective perspective now, if you're living in a reality where you're even disconnected within your family unit, and all you do within that family unit is fulfill a role, so you role play, and that role is assigned certain responsibilities, where I take my kid to school, then I go and fulfill my utility, then I maybe turn up for sports day, I spend a little bit of time with my wife, I spend a little bit of time with my friends. Everything's role play, but it's disconnected, and you're coming from perspective of what my rights are as an individual. Now, once you start breaking this down even further, if you look at the Freudian psychoanalytical system, so I'm really stripping this down so we can put it across. The Freudian psychoanalytical system looks at all motivation finding its root within the libido. So the root of it being your sexual energy. So even the concept that the baby suckling isn't suckling because it wants nourishment. There's a sexual motivation behind the act of suckling.
According to Freud. According to Freud.
According to Freud, but it's very interesting because you see Edward Bernays come in with his, and he's the nephew of Freud. He's the inventor of propaganda.
Mm.
He's the one who.
And this is the link you're making, just to clarify for people. So if everything has a sexual motive, Freudian, and then his nephew comes along and invents propaganda, you can see the link between propaganda and sexual motivation being, in their view, the most effective way to sell things.
Yeah, well, if we look at propaganda and we come back to general knowledge, let's forget about selling cigarettes as phallic symbols. Let's forget about that. Let's get to education now. Because once you start looking into the root of this, the development of the individual freedom, or what the idea of individual freedom is. You have to remember that, like, in 1967, we had the Summer of Love. Yeah? The Summer of Love. You had this idea of, like, you're expressing yourself and you're connecting with other human beings. You're no longer repressed by the dominion of the Christo-Judaic transactional religious system. Yeah? You're no longer restricted by it. So what we end up with this is that we get this we get all of these philosophers now that are now rebelling against that dominion. And if the root is this, like, if that dominion is restricting something, the greatest example of its restriction is what? The sexual energy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So it
when we're
needs to be
looking at this,
unleashed.
we see, when we're looking at this, you have to remember, Maajid, that 1967 is interesting because you have the Summer of Love. 1968 is the birth of postmodernism. Postmodernism. Yeah, modernism is already an issue it's already a problematic issue because we're talking about the invention of the concept of religion in the 17th century. The idea that previous to that, these are wisdom traditions and the wisdom traditions were securing an idea of reality. Now, follow me with this point here. We already discussed previously about, and I like Heidegger. Heidegger talked about the important, even though a lot of people dislike Heidegger because we always get conservative right wing thrown at us, don't we? As soon as you mention a philosopher that's from the Eurocentric academy that goes more towards classical tradition. But the point being here that one of the examples given is that if you have an object, that object, so we talked about, we use the analogy of the hammer. You walk into a house, there's a hammer on a table, and when you look at that hammer, you know the use of it, and you see the nails next to it, and the use of those nails also relates to the future, because what am I going to do? I'm going to hammer something into the wall, but the environment around it gives meaning to the hammer, and the nails and the table give meaning to each other. So the environment is dictated by the meanings each thing is given, and the role that thing plays in that environment. Then that also refers to what role you're playing, how you're being. Yeah. Now let's invert that. So this is coming to your satanic understanding. Let's invert that where you walk into an environment. Yeah. Now, when you walk into an environment, yeah, let's use the example of I get David, I spike David with some drugs that are going to take away your inhibitions. Yeah. Then I put you in the middle of Bangkok. Yeah. And the environment around you now you're looking around, your inhibitions have been taken away from you. You're looking around and judging your environment from a perspective of consequence. Yeah. So the environment now, but how does it tap into you? It taps into you from an appetite perspective, and you're analyzing it from a consequence perspective. Now, this is where that whole concept, because traditionally the idea of the devil and demons related to how you get possessed when your appetite drives you, so the understanding being that the window has been opened and this appetite has been empowered, and how's that appetite going to translate? It's going to translate through the language around you, which is where the symbolism comes in. So
is you just very quickly, this one eye thing, I want to because I think I've understood what you're saying, but you're saying this symbolically in Islamic tradition, this al-a'war al-kadhab, or the one-eyed liar, symbolizes a lack of perception.
Yeah, I'm going to simplify this.
Before you do, because this is what we're talking about. That is the one eye on the dollar bill. and this is celebrities are always doing it. This is an example. Is Katy Perry doing it? But David, you were right to mention it's everywhere in fashion photo shoots. That's the one that's on the dollar bill, but this is the kind of thing that's everywhere in fashion photo shoots. This is an example of, at least our tradition, decrying the emergence of the one eye as a lying, one-eyed antichrist. Yeah, and Usman, you're about to elaborate that this is in symbolic of, in Islamic tradition, of the emergence of a lacking in depth of perception and an overemphasis on consumption.
Yeah, and then what you get with this is the word reality in English comes from the Latin root word res, which means thing. Once you bring something into sensory perception, yeah, because we like to use this word scientifically proven. So basically, what it comes down to is your sensory perception, or what can, and then expanded upon that, what tools we can get to then expand upon our sensory perception. Yeah. Now, when we talk about all of this symbolism and the environment and consequence, what have we seen incrementally happening to this point? Now, back in 1978, Foucault, so Michel Foucault is a very important philosopher from a Western perspective. He did an interview on French radio talking about why non-consensual sex with a child is wrong. Yeah. Why
implying that consensual sex with a child he believes is okay.
Yeah, that he believed was okay, but further to this, you had other French philosophers as well sign a petition to lower the age of consent to 12. Yep. Now, that wasn't just other philosophers that did that. You had ministers there that did that as well. And the argument being that...
We had by the way, just in the UK, you may have heard of this, but we also had that initiative. There were a bunch of people that were politicians, senior ministers that supported the PI organization, known as the Paedophile Information Network, I think it was, or I don't know what the E stood for. Exchange, that's it, yeah. So we had that phenomenon here in Britain, and they were actively lobbying to lower the age of consent, and they were in very, very, very senior positions in government, including cabinet.
Well, look at it from this point. If you had that over here in France, you had the Paedophile Liberation Front. That's what it was called, the Paedophile Liberation Front at that time. And the argument that was put across them was that this was actually restrictive. It was restrictive and it was oppressive to the rights of children to express themselves, to live their reality. Does that language sound?
Yeah, because we can now talk about this is my lived experience, or this is my truth, which is the origins of a lot of that subjective assertion of fact is postmodernism.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we look at this, and I in analyzing all of this, because you start looking at it and you start saying, okay, well, who taught women that in order for them to be free, they should dress to titillate, because it's not empowering them, it's actually objectifying them. So what you start seeing is like incrementally all the way through, you see this thing where you're using, once again, education, general knowledge to create insecurity, to create this and individuality, because remember, you've been taught your tools for what you think. You've been taught to measure reality for what you think is rational and reasonable. So even when we're talking about this stuff here, David, where we're talking about satanic symbolism, what I've just explained to you there is literally, this isn't literally, factually, the Semitic standing, because these of reality. So the idea of the environment around you and symbolism creating, whether it taps into an appetite or whether that window is closed to that appetite. So when you were talking about Andrew Tate talking about it the other day, where was Tate coming from? He was coming from a reading of the books that I've studied under literal masters of this subject.
These are
Yeah.
we have the guy, David, above Usman's head is our spiritual teacher, Sufi Sheikh Ali. And Usman and I, we consider the way is to spiritual enlightenment, is to be connected, very, very rooted to reality and our spiritual selves, which is in essence is what we are.
And to wrap that up properly, to say, yeah, my wife's a psychiatrist. Yeah. The work that we did within counterterrorism was recognized as a traditional Islamic behavioral therapy, where we went into linguistics, where we went into environment, where we went into a collective approach, a systems approach. But the point is with this, that what we've got going on with this symbolism is that we've got to a point now where if you look at the way people are moving around, they're moving around from a perspective of consumption. But what does that consumption do? You have anticipation, you have consumption, then you have what? Emptiness. And this
Anti-climax,
is
post-consumption, anti-climax.
Post-consumption.
I'm worried about time. I just want to bring David back in for concluding thoughts, David, on this. Everything you've heard and all, tie it all together, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm no expert on all this, but I have been keeping an eye on it for years, and I think Andrew Tate summed it up quite well. He goes down the rabbit hole of that. Like, I mean, just on the one eye thing. I mean, obviously, there's the reason for that there's a reason for the one eye, but now it's more of a shorthand to say I'm owned by the people who really believe that. So Greta Thunberg's done it. She probably doesn't know anything about that, but it's a shorthand way to say I'm with the people who do all that. But I mean, Andrew Tate was saying that it's like a karmic thing, which I'm not completely knowledgeable about either, but that it's like if they tell you they're going to hurt, if someone's going to poison you with an apple, if they give you an apple and say, here's a nice apple, and you eat it and you die, then they did bad, they killed you. But if they say, here's a poisoned apple, and then the person eats it, then they committed suicide. As far as these people are concerned, it's a karma thing, so they're not responsible now. So if they tell you all this stuff, it's not their fault if you if you believe it or whatever. But so it's literally they're laying open all this stuff, say this is what we believe. This is I mean, literally anybody who makes it to the very top of the entertainment industry, they just go down this whole satanic thing. I mean, have you seen the latest one by Sam Smith? I mean, that video. It's just ludicrously horrible. It's all just the usual stuff. It's just. I mean, it's not like the old days with Adamant, jumping off a coach and horses, and shooting a gun. It's like every single video it's nowadays that I see anyway, that I mean, I don't look at many videos, but there's just all these ludicrous things, and so they're just having a laugh at us, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I literally don't know. I mean, I don't believe in anything, but I don't think you have to believe in Satan to do all this stuff, because it's like a club, you know. It's like, you know,
Well,
you
because
get
also, David, when you say believing in something, it's essentially it's the same thing. Whether they believe literally in Satan or not, the idea that my purpose is to consume is what some people would say is Satanism. Now, if you look at these things symbolically, you know, in terms of symbols, and you understand that somebody who has surrendered themselves to a master whose purpose is to exploit and consume, and at once becomes a tool of that consumption and exploitation, while also being a weapon for it, which is what these celebrities do. You see, they often sing and boast, and Katy Perry's done this. They talk about having sold their souls to the devil. Yeah. Now, the idea simply is, in return, in exchange for worldly riches and gain, I join a network that exists for the sole purpose of maximizing consumption and pleasure and exploitation. But in return for joining that network, I will do certain things for them, but also receive certain things in return. Some of the things I may do for them, for example, is procure. But if in the process, like Ghislaine Maxwell was doing, right? In the process of procuring, Ghislaine, who may not have had Epstein's appetite for all the girls that she was procuring, was rewarded handsomely and financially, because her father, Maxwell, if you recall, who was considered a double agent or a triple agent, whatever he was, with Mossad and in the UK, whatever he was, he ended up falling off a yacht, whether he killed himself or was killed, because the big insurance scandal when he ripped off all these people in Britain. So she ends up with no father, no riches that she grew up with. She finally then basically tags along with Epstein, gets rewarded with all this wealth and access to people and money and travel. Now she's got a new father figure. In return, the quid pro quo is she procures girls for Epstein. So the idea is selling your soul. Whether Ghislaine Maxwell or, say, Epstein literally believed in a horned a humanoid figure with horns coming out of its head, or they entirely and 100% believe that their presence on Earth is for maximizing consumption by exploiting others around you for the purposes of consumption and pleasure, that's what some people call is succumbing to Satan. Because of Usman, your point, which is demon, and the origin of the word is a internal thing, that to become possessed by something, and in this case, possessed by lust, or possessed by greed, or possessed by pleasure, the desire to attain pleasure, or whatever, wealth, or, you know, whatever the one thing that one's possessed by. Other people would say you have surrendered to Satan. So they're just speaking.
Yeah. Or let me give you an innocent example of this, David. Yeah. You ever had it where your blood sugar goes down and you're like, I could do with a Snickers bar, or I could do with a Mars bar, yeah? And even if someone comes up to you, your wife might come up to you, I've got a tuna sandwich. No, I need some chocolate. And you're in that mode, you're like, okay, got to find me some chocolate somewhere, yeah? What it talks about with this is that depending on the different avenues of appetite, there's a level of motivation that once that fire's lit, where you will justify. Like, I'll give you the example of Keith Vaz. Do you remember the politician Keith Vaz?
He was caught with boys, wasn't he? For rent boys. He was caught with rent boys.
Right. And he was going and playing a character, wasn't he? So I think he was a washing machine repairman or something. It was a very interesting news piece, and he was getting Eastern European rent boys. Now, what was that personality? What was that appetite? What was that personality that he was playing? Now, when you got him, and if you sat him down, he would say to you, he'd rationalize it and say, if he was sat in front of his wife, he might say, oh, baby, it just took me over. It's just a need that I had. I couldn't help it. Yeah, and this is why it talks about possession, and that's why it gives you symbolism. The thing with this stuff is, David, none of it has ever been in the way that it's been interpreted, where you've got, and this is why you've had such a rebellion in Europe to it, which is, yo, Jehovah over here, the devil over here, the demons are running around, and it's never been about that. It's been an understanding of there's symbolic and then there's tranquility. So the concept being that from a Muslim perspective, I can sit, and if someone says to me, I know Allah, yeah, I know Allah from a tranquility perspective. Yeah. But same with you, David. When you see the sunset and you feel that awe and you're like, I'm not giving this to God. Some Jehovah's not sitting out there. This sunset is this sunset. The awe of this sunset. Yeah. When your heart's beating, the whole concept, and this is what Allah, Allah, Allah. That's where we refer chaos, chaos and order, and the center. So your center is the same as my center. So saying, how do we stay in that state of tranquility and connect to the higher consciousness, which is to connect and alleviate suffering, which is what we've been talking about for the last 2 hours, which has been, how do we set something up to connect and alleviate suffering? And that's what it's talking about here, David. The problem with it is when you want me to live in my imagination. Sorry, I don't want to live in my imagination. You scared the hell out of me before by sticking us all in our houses for 2 years by telling us that. Do you see the point? Imagination, consistent pessimism.
Based, of course, built on compounded ignorance, Jahil Murakkab. Now, I think I should call it here. We have been talking for 2 hours and 6 minutes, and we expected only to talk for 1 hour. So, David, I think you should consider that a bit of a success, mate. For your first, you said you weren't too used to interviews. It's gone really well. Hope you had a good time. Hope you've enjoyed talking. Next week, everyone, on Warrior Creed, same time, same place, we'll be speaking to former England professional football player Matt Le Tissier. It's fantastic because we happen to have him while the World Cup will be going on. Who knows where England will be by then. But we'll be speaking to Matt Le Tissier, not just about Qatar and the World Cup, obviously, because he's Matt Le Tissier, but also everything else current. And by then, who knows what would have happened in the news. But it seems to be multiple Black Swan events that keep coming at us. So we'll have plenty to speak about. But David Fleming, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David.
I encourage everybody to go to notourfuture.org.
Yeah.
Notourfuture.org. Join up. We'll be working and collaborating, hopefully, with David as well. David,
definitely,
we'll be in touch, Usman and I, just to organise a curry. We'd love to see you. Are you London-based, David?
Well, I work in London, so I'm there every day. So
great.
Yeah.
Well, that's us. We do it. Usually, we meet on Monday nights. We haven't done for 2 weeks. Ubbles of it. He's been messaging me yesterday.
What about tomorrow?
Yeah, we'll organise
tomorrow for us. I'm on about.
Yeah, we'll organise it offline. But other than that, guys, everyone, we'll see you next week with Matt Le Tissier here, Warrior Creed, and don't forget this one. This live stream goes out via Radical Media on Substack as well, maajidnawaz.substack.com, where you can get the podcast version if you liked what you heard today. And the live stream video remains up exclusive to Getter, and that's GETTR if you go to Getter at Maajid Nawaz. All right, everyone. We're going to put up the music now to leave. But before we go, David, any last words? Are you happy?
No, I'm happy. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge. Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warrior.